Welcome back. I've been posting a series of videos on a course that I've been prototyping, designing some online modules for, really interested in people's feedback. And it's a course designed around a systems theory, or what some would call the bioecological systems theory. And it's set up around the thought of multiple systems influencing each individual, and specifically each individual's communication. And so at the center is the self, the individual, me or you, at the core of these circles. Around that circle are others, family, friends, peers, colleagues. We'll talk about those in another video. Then around the self, surrounded by others, is systems that have a huge impact, and that's what this video will talk about, is the systems piece. And in a previous video, I talked about the structures, the structural pieces, things such as the constitution of countries, legislation, laws. So where I live in Canada, and specifically in British Columbia, there are things such as the Indian Act, for example, still in force, still called the same thing, that has a huge impact on people. There are things such as the numbered treaties, modern day treaties with Indigenous peoples in this era of reconciliation after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Those are big structural pieces. There's international agreements. There's the big annual conference going on around climate change. And so those are the big structural pieces, and I talked about those in an earlier video. This video is about the systems, and there's no real clear distinct line between many of these circles. They intermingle and intermesh with each other frequently, back and forth, and it's not nearly as neat and tidy as the diagram will make it. And the systems are largely the institutions. And so institutions, I mean that in two senses. So one sense is when we talk about things such as the institution of marriage, the institution of family, the institution of education. Those types of things is one meaning of institution. The second meaning of institution is the actual institutions themselves, some of them physical. In this day and age, with the growth of the internet, some of them may not be necessarily physical. So these are things such as education, which is an institution in itself, but then the specific institutions of education, like kindergarten to grade 12, primary school, secondary school, higher education, colleges, universities, those types of things. And those, based on structural influences like the Constitution and the division of responsibilities between the federal government and provincial government, education is a provincial responsibility. Healthcare is largely a provincial responsibility. Transportation, largely a provincial responsibility. So these types of things influence everyone's day-to-day lives. So also intermeshed into that, especially in British Columbia where I live, is the influence and the impact of treaties. And so there's part of BC in the northeast that's covered by Treaty 8, one of the numbered treaties from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And now there are more modern day treaties, such as the Nisga'a Treaty in northwest BC in the 90s. And then more recently, some of the other treaties that have been settled, SWOSN, for example, in the lower mainland and the Vancouver area, and more negotiation that's been going on for decades and decades. The reality in BC is historically, no land was ever surrendered. First Nations people there was no conquest, they didn't give things up. And yet, when Canada was formed and British Columbia formed and then joined part of the Federation, it was at that point in time largely Hudson's Bay Company territory, a story for another time, but then was asserted to be Crown title, quote unquote. And yet, many First Nations have been trying to negotiate treaties for decades, and this essentially sets up a lot of dispute, and much of BC is actually, in fact, probably disputed territory and continues to play out in the courts. And there's landmark decisions such as the Silcotin decision, which actually allocated land through Aboriginal rights and title through the Supreme Court of Canada. So again, there's this real intermingling between structures and systems that have a big impact on communities and people around us and the institutions in which we operate. The other, for example, is healthcare. And healthcare, we can even see if you follow the media. Just recently, there were meetings between the federal government and the provincial governments that were tense around funding because there's transfers of tax dollars from the federal government to the provincial governments. And they were trying to settle an agreement, and the federal government wanted access to more data, and things broke down and they didn't come to an agreement. Often tense types of negotiations like that. In British Columbia, where I live, very unique in that decade or more, there was an agreement reached between the federal government, the provincial government, and First Nations leadership. Because under the structural components of legislation, Section 91, 92 of the Constitution, the Indian Act and Indigenous peoples are quote-unquote responsibility of the federal government, a fiduciary trust-like relationship that exists. And so for reserves and reserve land is actually considered a federal responsibility, and there can be some tense but also just complicated discussions and negotiation when you've got municipalities right alongside and right beside what is considered a First Nations reserve. Municipalities are a provincial responsibility by legislation, and so it sets up quite a complex relationship between all three partners. And the same is played out in healthcare. And so there is a tripartite agreement between all those partners, which has resulted in partnering and funding transfers for delivery of health services on reserve, and partnerships between the provincial responsibility for healthcare, the federal responsibility for Indigenous peoples, and then First Nations leadership itself. And most of this, in spite of the fact that the over 200 First Nations in BC, the majority of them don't have a treaty and are still in negotiations. And that type of relationship and agreement may not be in the day-to-day household in British Columbia, but it affects every resident, and it affects how funding is allocated, it affects how healthcare is delivered, and probably 100% of citizens in BC at some point in their life are going to interact with the healthcare system or be impacted by it. And so those types of things can be critical within communication, especially if you're a healthcare worker working with someone who is from an Indigenous community, or in any other institution, whether you work in education. And so these are all really critical parts of influencing and impacting how respectful communication and conflict can occur between people. So again, similar to what I said with the structures, is sometimes there can be influences and pressures that create conflict in an interpersonal setting, which are actually due to components outside of that particular relationship. And similarly, so for example, somebody who self-identifies as Indigenous may go in for healthcare services, but there's something that is a barrier to that service being provided based on the legislation. And I'm making up a totally hypothetical situation, but a conflict ensues. And as often happens with many humans, when a conflict ensues, it then becomes personal and interpersonal. And then there is a conflict between who said what, where, how, and why. And yet the conflict was largely created or supported or induced by systems and structures outside of that relationship. And so if we can start to break some of those down or raise awareness of why things can be complicated, why some things can be slow, might really assist in some more interpersonal communication. We can see, for example, as well in Ontario, as I'm making this video, disputes between education workers and unions. And so labor relations is also a provincial responsibility and has a huge impact. I'm watching in British Columbia, where I live, and several unions are actually coming up with agreements in the public sector. It's a really tough time with the pandemic and otherwise, and this isn't even getting into the impact on healthcare organizations are facing from the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, with a real crisis in healthcare, with not enough workers and the costs and not enough physicians. And so all of those really affect the people around us and ourselves within, and that's the next nest that I'll get into. So that's a real quick summary of the systems circle that's very intimately connected into the structure circle that pushes down onto people around us, families, colleagues, friends, and into the institutions that we go and interact with, that might assist in our interpersonal communication and conflict navigation, in understanding that there may be pressures or things occurring in other people's lives that we don't have an awareness of, that is outside of their life as well. And so that's why I look at this systems structures. And then now in the next video, I'll start to look at that relationship where we get right into those interpersonal pieces where it's with families, friends, colleagues, but also the people that work at many of the institutions and organizations which we interact with on a daily basis, which can also be a source of conflict. Let me know what you think of this. I'm curious, and whether this is landing, resonating, am I missing pieces that I should be highlighting more? Curious. Let me know. That's the systems component within this larger overall model of thinking about interpersonal communication, intrapersonal inside of each of us, and conflict management.